One of the most impressive arcade games I remember from the 1980s was Sega's Thunderblade. It was released in 1987 and used Sega's X-Board Superscaler. Man, was it a beauty. There had been great looking Superscalers before, but this was nothing short of a stunner the first time you saw it. Not only did it have the forward-scrolling perspective, but it also had an overhead view that made you feel like you were looking down from a great height. It looks so three-dimensional, and even now in 2023, I still look at this with the awe and wonder of a child. When Sega made arcade magic, man, it always made you take notice. Of course, when the home version landed on the Sega Master System in 1988, it was pared back heavily with the expected cuts for the weaker 8-bit hardware. It came on a 2 megabit cartridge, and for what it wasn't the worst game ever made. When the Sega Genesis showed up in 1989, it made all kinds of bold assertions about bringing the arcade home, so you can imagine my excitement at seeing Super Thunderblade show up in the advertising. I was finally going to see that beautiful arcade game at home, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. In this episode, we are going to take a look at Super Thunderblade for the Sega Genesis, compare it to the original arcade, and see how it all turned out. Did it do the arcade justice, or did it crash and burn, leaving us all wanting more? Let's find out. In Super Thunderblade, you pilot a gunship whose mission it is to take down a well-armed group of rogue soldiers. That's right, these are the same bad guys you fought in the original arcade release, back and stronger than ever. Gameplay is fairly similar, but some things have changed a bit here. You begin each mission from the third-person forward-scrolling perspective. Enemies and their weapon fire come directly at the screen in an attempt to blow you out of the sky. You'll face both air and ground units, but also must be mindful of obstacles like trees and buildings, which you can crash into just as easily. To deal with your foes, you have both a Vulcan cannon and a missile launcher which fire together, giving you double the chance to take down enemy units. You also have the ability to use the air brake to stop the forward scrolling, but you'll want to be careful because this leaves you an easy target. Halfway through each mission, the action stops and you'll face a sub-boss, typically a larger enemy with quite a bit more firepower. The stage then continues from the forward-scrolling perspective for the second part of the area. After another stretch of battle, you then switch to an overhead perspective where you are attacking a large vessel, which is essentially the final boss of the area. There are 4 stages in total, making this one hell of a short experience. Back in 1989, I was an arcade kid through and through. It was this fact that attracted me to the Sega Genesis in the first place. To say my expectations were high for Super Thunderblade is a major understatement. The Genesis was supposed to be 16-bit magic, bringing the arcade home at a level like never before. To set the stage properly, you need to understand that a 14-year-old Sega Lord X did not have the luxury of understanding the shortcomings of the Genesis hardware at its release, nor did he have the 30-plus years of hindsight that he has right now. No, it was in that moment when Super Thunderblade was played for the very first time that I was so utterly underwhelmed and disappointed. I had expected something at least close to the arcade original, and instead what I was left with is what you see here. This choppy mess of a game is slow, clunky, and nowhere near an adequate representation of the coin-op. Even when considered from a more modern viewpoint, the animated jump in sizes for the sprites is jarring, and makes everything look terrible in the process. This only gets worse as the environment gets more complicated. In the second stage, the transitions between the open forest and the caves looks like they didn't even try to get it seamless. It's just these giant color changes in the oncoming scenery. But the biggest crime here is the overhead areas. Gone are the cool top-down effects seen in the arcade. It's reasonable to expect these stages to have been scaled back some on the Genesis, but to be removed entirely is just unforgivable. As an added affront, the PC Engine version attempted to duplicate the arcade in this sense, making you think the Motorola 68,000 power Genesis could have at least done as well. Instead, only the boss encounter is using the overhead perspective, and then there are no special effects whatsoever on display. There's also no in-game story at all, no real cinematics, no text explaining what you're doing and why. Nope, you get nothing even when you defeat the game. The fact is, this is a bare bones reimagining of the original arcade presented as a sequel, yet it looks and runs far worse and adds absolutely nothing of value visually, right down to the complete absence of cinematics. This was 4 megabits of graphical disappointment, even way back in 1989. Sega Genesis sound can be hit or miss sometimes, and here you'll get both sides of that coin. On one hand, I really enjoyed the first and fourth stage compositions, but found stages 2 and 3 to be grating and not nearly as enjoyable. Since there are only really 4 musical selections in the entire game, let's have a listen to all 4 and see what you think. Gameplay in Super Thunder Blade is as you'd expect. The on-rail shooting is mostly serviceable despite the choppy visuals. Since most of the gameplay takes place during the forward-scrolling segments, that means there is some fun you can have with this once you get used to the slow and floaty movement. But let's not pat Sega on the back for this mess, because this was as bare bones and as little effort as an arcade port could get on a platform like the Genesis. The overhead segments aren't just visually a letdown, but the control is complete garbage as well. You have zero ability to move forward and backward, and can only move side to side. Not only does this make later boss fights tough, but you simply get tired of being so limited when pretty much every other shooter ever released allows you the full screen to move around on. I mean, why was this implemented? Who thought it a good idea to make a new 16-bit game that was strangled with play control that made Atari 2600 titles seem complicated? Even the PC Engine version allowed forward movement to counter the lack of altitude change. We also need to really consider the dearth of content here. 4 stages, no story, and sold at full retail price. To combat this extreme shortness, Sega made it a tough game for beginners. You will be shot down a lot when you first attempt playing it, but there is a motion you can get used to where you can avoid enemy fire quite reliably. That means after only a few days of practice, you will beat this in a mere 20 minutes or so. And with absolutely no reward in terms of an ending, there's no real reason to return. Going back to the 14-year-old Sega Lord X, he was disappointed to say the least. Sega had failed to give him an arcade quality experience, and worse, had not given more content to make up for it, and still charged him full price. You can sugarcoat this any number of ways to make it sound better. You can excuse the visuals because it was a launch title. You can excuse the lack of content because of its arcade roots. We can even excuse the overhead gameplay by chalking it up to staying like the arcade. But all these things have counterpoints that put the game in a bad light. The PC Engine edition tried to do more with the visuals. The content was ludicrous for a $50 release with gameplay this simplistic. I mean, Sega had some short games at launch, but at least the better ones burned bright while they lasted. And finally, the overhead sections are just a complete waste of space. It's true the arcade only allowed left and right movement as well, but you have to remember there was an altitude adjustment there. Here you are completely missing that. If Sega was going to do as little work as possible on the graphics and story, the least they could have done is giving us more stages. As it is, this is a short game that failed to impress on pretty much every level. I really didn't want to hate on this one, but I'd be lying to you to say anything other than how I felt at the time. The Genesis let me down quite a few times during its first 6 months or so, and Super Thunderblade was a big part of that. It's easy to sit back in hindsight and talk about how the Genesis lacked hardware sprite scaling and measure your expectations for software of this nature. But in 1989, that conversation was a non-factor entirely. It really was all down to the expectations of a young boy just wanting his new machine to show him something close to what he had seen in the arcade. And let's be frank, this just wasn't it. Gaming magazines were also not kind to Super Thunderblade. Most US publications were tough on it. When it was released on digital services years later, more modern perspectives were even rougher, often labeling it one of the weaker Genesis titles on the service. But for all my complaints here, I have seen countless Genesis fans that absolutely loved it. They regale me with stories of getting it as a kid and playing it to death, and still having great memories of it. I just can't share the same experience this time. Super Thunderblade was a weak game then, and it's a weak addition to the library now. Among the games that imitated superscalar technology on the Genesis, few were truly impressive, especially at the beginning. But this one has nothing else to offer on top of the weak presentation, making it an all-around disappointment few will find any real enjoyment in. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.